last night from Ramallah through New York, very long trip. He, as some of you know, he's one of the founders of the BDS movement. Back in 2004, started with the academic and cultural boycott campaign, and then grew into the BDS international movement that it is today. And Omar is an electrical engineer by trade, but on the side, a very big side, he works on politics and activism, especially involved in cultural and academic boycott. He's finishing his PhD in ethical philosophy, nothing to do with electrical engineering, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about that and the problems he's having at Tel Aviv University, which he's asking people to boycott. So.
Okay. So the first question was about the Goldstone, Richard Goldstone UN report, the fact-finding mission. How will this help the BDS movement? And the second question is, what can American activists do to promote the movement? The first question, the Goldstone report has been an extremely useful event. It's a watershed in the movement, in the BDS movement, because everything we've been saying since we started the boycott movement has been vindicated, has been proven to be correct. What Richard Goldstone told the world is what we've been saying all along. Israel is committing grave war crimes and crimes against humanity with total impunity. And Goldstone used those very terms. This impunity in committing indiscriminate, disproportionate violence has to come to an end. Exactly. Therefore, BDS. I mean, that's what he could not say. I mean, you read the Goldstone report and it jumps at you. What do you want to do? There's nothing left to do except isolate Israel as South Africa was isolated. It's just the most natural conclusion that any reasonable observer who reads the Goldstone report can reach after reading it. So he has helped us tremendously. He has shaken Israel's impunity already, even without having a UN tribunal for Israeli war crimes and so on. The very fact that a Zionist Jewish judge like Goldstone, and he's very Zionist, by the way. I mean, the fact that he wrote a good report does not mean anything about his ideology. He's very Zionist. But he was even so shocked, although he's a Zionist, that Israel would commit such crimes. He could not believe it until he went to Gaza, and he wrote this much in op-eds in different places. He said, I couldn't believe Israel would do such things, like indiscriminately shell a UN shelter with white phosphorus bombs, burning little children and women. He couldn't believe they would do this. Of course we do. We've been living it for 6 years. But for Goldstone to say it, he broke through the mainstream barriers against our information. He reached the very mainstream. Of course, this whole episode of rejecting his report and the US now, Congress is meeting to condemn Goldstone, it's adding legitimacy to what we are saying. It's adding legitimacy. If they can't live with such a mild, and it's a very mild report compared to the reality on the ground. Goldstone said, he focused on some cases, 30-some cases of all the crimes that happened in Gaza. That's a drop in a bucket of what happened in Gaza. But even that drop in a bucket made him reach the conclusion that Israel has to try those war criminals, or the world should take Israel to trial. That is the key. So I think it's extremely important for the BDS movement. Since the Goldstone report, the BDS movement has seen another jump. Since the Gaza massacre anyway, the BDS movement has leaped forward. After Goldstone, even further. I'll give examples that I didn't have time to say about European sanctions against Israel, which is very new. Norway, the pension fund in Norway, which is the third largest in the world, decided to divest from an Israeli military contractor called Elbit, because it's supplying surveillance equipment to the wall, to the illegal wall. It's a $6 million deal, the investment. It's not that big, but it's the symbolism. This is the first Western government to divest from an Israeli company. That's a sanction. The second was Spain. The Spanish government kicked an Israeli team out of a competition because they represent a university built on occupied Palestinian territory, Ariel College. That was the first time ever that a European government is excluding an Israeli team from an academic competition. That's very new. So we are breaking new ground. Goldstone played a major role in that, breaking new ground. As to your second question, how can activists in this country help? It's very big. There's so many things to do, and this is the belly of the beast. I mean, this is it. We either make it or break it in the US. All our successes in Britain and Norway and Spain are minor compared to the potential in this country. It is here where Israel will lose or win its battle for legitimacy of its apartheid system and its occupation. It's been winning so far, and it feels that it might lose, but it's not happening yet in the US. But of course we see a lot of potential. Why? Not just money. I mean, money is extremely important. Israel gets billions. Forget the 3 billion from the government. The tax-exempt donations from Zionist organizations to Israel are maybe double what the government is paying. So total Israel gets about $8 to $10 billion a year from this country. Tax-exempt, all tax-exempt. So this is not minor. Even for a country like Israel, which is strong economically, that's a lot of money. And it's not just direct money. It's Israeli products selling in the US. Israeli companies that are taking over certain industries in the US where they are not fairly competing, really. I mean, they're taking a lot of business away from other companies when they don't need to. But it's also the legitimacy of the Israeli occupation and apartheid. Israel cannot get away with the crimes it's committing without the US support, because this is the only empire in the world now. It's extremely powerful. So if it says it's okay what Israel is doing, no one dares to say anything in Europe, in the rest of the world. So it's very important what activists can do in many different ways. Israel bonds, many of the municipalities, churches, institutions, unions are invested in Israeli companies, in Israeli government bonds, in companies that are benefiting the Israeli economy and profiting from the Israeli occupation and the apartheid system. Divesting is extremely important. So any activist in any institution can work with his or her institution for a divestment motion at a university, at a union, at a church, at a school, and so on. Social organization, synagogue, and so on and so forth. And many of these things are happening, but very slowly. There's a co-op in Brooklyn, completely Jewish co-op, by the way. Some Jewish activists decided that they want to ban all settlement products from that co-op. And it was a big, huge controversy in Brooklyn. But the Zionists, the extreme Zionists, had a lot of difficulty, convincing the majority. They did convince the majority not to boycott Israeli settlement products, but it took a long struggle. Even in Brooklyn, it took a long struggle for them to win that war. And it's not over yet. The Jewish activists who want to ban those products are still at it. They said, okay, we lost this year, we'll put it to vote in 2 years. It has empowered them that they find, with BDS, they find tools that they can use very effectively to end Israel's oppression. It might take some time. In the US, it will take time, because the lobby and the resistance are amazingly huge. They're very big. But it's happening, and the most important thing that I started with and I'll end with, they have not invented the weapon yet to stop this. Really. It's just a matter of convincing more people, and you can pass it. If it took 20, 30 years with the South Africans, it's taking much less with us. So some unions are already debating divesting. Some universities, Hampshire College in the US, was the first university in the world to divest from Israeli companies benefiting from the Israeli occupation. And by the way, it was the first in the South African struggle as well to divest from South African apartheid. Okay, how does the BDS movement work with this huge global network, and how does it sustain itself in terms of management offices and so on and so forth? The BDS movement until 2 months ago was completely volunteer-based. Totally volunteer-based. We're all volunteers in the movement. Just 2 months ago, we employed 2 employees, one in Brussels and one in Ramallah, and that's it. We don't have offices. We don't have money. We don't spend money. We just have very, very, very little. But it's an umbrella of many organizations. So when we plan an activity, all the organizations chip in. They sustain the movement. We have a leadership of the BDS movement called the BDS National Committee, the BNC. The BNC is the decision maker, and it has representation from all the major organizations and not organizations, networks really. So the Palestinian NGO network, PINGO, which has 150 organizations or so, is represented. The trade union federations are all represented, the women's union represented, and so on. So we have representation from all civil society. We make the decisions, and there's a secretariat between the BNC's meetings. There's a secretariat that runs the daily business, so to speak, mostly by email. We have a huge global network, but it's a very loose network, a very diverse network. It's not a political party. You don't have to agree on everything. What you have to agree with is the BDS call, the main principles, and then when it comes to tactics, you decide your own tactics that suit your context. The most important rule or principle about the BDS movement is that it's context sensitive. This is the number one principle. It's context sensitive. What we do in Britain, we don't do in the US, we don't expect to do in the US. Definitely, we don't expect to do it in Germany. So, in Britain, we ask for a complete, total boycott against every Israeli product, Israeli institution, and so on. That we can do in Britain. We cannot do this in the US. We have to go with much lower demands at the beginning. But that's up to the US activists to decide. What they can or cannot do, they know best. We don't know. In Ramallah or Haifa or Jerusalem, we don't know how best to do BDS in Spain, the US, or Canada. You guys know best. You know the territory, you know the scene, you know the balance of powers, and you know how to do it best. So we cooperate. I'll give another example, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a relatively big liberal Jewish, progressive Jewish group that has about 90,000 people signed on its list, mailing list. So it's influential. They have not endorsed BDS as such. It's a bit difficult for them. But they have joined in the boycott of Ahava, the Israeli cosmetics company. They're now considering, I can't talk about more details because it's not announced yet, but they're discussing with us a certain targeted boycott campaign that will be really big in the US. So even groups that are not signed onto the BDS call are joining the BDS movement by joining one of the actions. And we never dictate actions, we never dictate tactics. It's up to the activists on the ground to decide. That's the key. So we maintain a global network that all agree on the principles of the BDS movement, all agree on the BDS call, and some of them don't even agree on the BDS call fully, but they agree on doing BDS. And we maintain a network of coordination and information, and as I said, mutual inspiration. It's not direct orders, or we don't do that. Okay, the question was about non-violence and violence, that Israel's supporters and apologists always accuse the Palestinians of using violence to resist the occupation and so on, but the BDS movement is a non-violent movement, so how does that work out with them? Do we bring this point out and so on? Before going into that debate, which is better and what we do as non-violent resistance and so on, the first thing is we question the person who's presenting that question. In other words, Israel should be the last to talk about violence and non-violence. It is the most violent entity that exists in this entire region. So it's the last to talk about violence. We don't take lectures from Israel or its supporters about violence or non-violence. We also don't take lectures from whites in general about violence and non-violence. I mean, the white race has been the most violent in the history of mankind. No other race has committed as much genocide as the white race, if we want to talk about race. So we don't usually take criticism from white Americans, white Europeans, that you guys are too violent. Well, look at your history. I mean, in this nation, for example, the entire abolition of the indigenous Indians. So the last people that can teach us about nonviolence, Europeans, really, whether they're in America or Europe. But having put that aside, in general, we believe that people under occupation in international law have a right to resist by any means, including violent means. That's a right. That does not give us the right, though, to resist indiscriminately. So, yes, international law allows us to resist violently and non-violently, but it does not allow us to resist indiscriminately. That is not right, it is not morally tenable, and it's not justifiable. In the BDS movement, we don't say we're against violent resistance. We're saying what we're doing is, by definition, non-violent resistance. Those who are opposed to violent resistance, or those who are not, cannot but admit that BDS is non-violent. I mean, we don't kill, we don't call for violence, we don't do any violent acts. It's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Extreme, it's as non-violent as it gets. People who have trouble with that, as I said earlier, don't want resistance, period. They don't want us to resist. They want us to surrender, as I said. So yes, we do present the issue that this is a non-violent resistance, but we don't overdo it because we're not in a defensive position. We don't have to answer to anyone accusing us whether we're doing violence or non-violence. It's a very non-violent movement by definition. Actually, one person asked me that question specifically. He said, okay, ending the occupation is okay, but you're asking for equality in Israel, so you want to destroy Israel. I said, okay, let me reconstruct what you just said. You're saying equality means the destruction of Israel. That means Israel is based, its main foundation is inequality. If you take that away, it collapses. Is that a state you want to maintain? A state that's a regime that's based on total inequality? We're not calling for destroying anyone. We're talking about transforming a system that is racist by definition into an egalitarian democratic system. If you call that destruction, go ahead, but we're not destroying anyone. So we answer that very definition of you want to destroy Israel. What does that mean? Did anyone destroy South Africa by transforming it from apartheid to democracy? Did anyone destroy Germany by ending the Nazi rule and making Germany a democratic country? You don't destroy countries by making them democratic. You transform them positively. The question was J Street, whether there's any position towards J Street in the BDS movement and so on. We haven't discussed it as a movement, so I don't have an official position. My personal position is that J Street is AIPAC light. It's much worse. I've written before about Kerry versus Bush, and I called Kerry Bush Light, which was much worse than, I call them Marlboro Lights. It's like light cigarettes. You smoke them, feeling them, they're so good, they don't have the problems of the other, but they're just as bad, but you smoke much more of them because you think they're healthy. Yeah. So Bush Light is not better than Bush, sometimes it can be much worse. Also AIPAC Light is not better than AIPAC, it's much worse in my opinion. J Street is smarter, more sophisticated, more modern. I mean, AIPAC is really a dinosaur. Really stuck in a 19th century kind of hit them with a stick and very bullying and very intimidating. It worked very well for a while. I mean, a very efficient campaign. But it's dissipating. And they know they cannot last too long. Plus the corruption charges and espionage and so on that's coming against them. AIPAC will not survive in the next 10 years. We'll see the demise of AIPAC. This grand AIPAC is disappearing like the dinosaurs. So you need a more sophisticated, younger, zesty, sexy kind of lobby, and that's J Street. The same Zionist principles, the same opposition to Palestinian rights, the same, a lot of foundations are the same, but they present them in much more sexy, modern ways. So they say, we love Israel and we love peace. They never define what, okay, loving Israel, that's clear, we understand what that is. But what does loving peace mean? I mean, everyone loved peace. Hitler did, Sharon did. Everyone loves peace. I mean, you won't find a human being on earth who says, I'm against peace. Every dictator, every butcher in the world thinks of themselves as struggling for peace. What you have to define is what peace is. From our perspective, the oppressed, peace without justice is not worth its name. That's not something we want. Peace without justice is surrender. It's not something the oppressed wants. It's always the oppressors that want peace, as in tranquility. We dictate the order, and you just follow the order and just be quiet. We want silence. That is peace. That's the peace of the grave, I call it. We don't want that peace. So J Street wants peace. What kind of peace? They're not ready to end Israel's oppression in the three forms. They're not ready to support the right of return. They're not ready to question Israel's right to have an apartheid regime. So what kind of peace do they want? The question was, is there a list of targets for the boycott and divestment movement in the US that the Palestinian movement is considering or suggesting to American activists? Actually, I was at the conference of the US Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, which is the umbrella of all organizations working for Palestinian rights in the US. And it was in Chicago not too long ago. They were debating this very question. It's not an easy, we don't have a list yet. They were debating this very question. What are the best targets for BDS in the US? And they're still debating. Because the US is so huge and so consequential for the movement, you can't take this decision lightly. So there was an anti-Caterpillar campaign for a long while. I'm personally not very impressed with the Caterpillar campaign unless it changes drastically, because you don't buy a Caterpillar every day. It's not something that people can boycott easily. A Motorola campaign, on the other hand, is very effective because everyone can buy a Motorola. So Motorola is a much better target, in my opinion. So it's what class of targets we're talking about. That's still being very debated. Academic and cultural boycott are, of course, extremely important in the US. So institutional, and just for the record to explain, academic and cultural boycott target Israeli institutions rather than individuals. We don't target Israeli academics or Israeli artists. We target Israeli academic and cultural institutions for their complicity, because they're very complicit in maintaining the occupation and apartheid system. So that's a very important target in the US. One example was Bat Sheva, the most famous Israeli dance company. When they came to tour the United States, right after Gaza, I mean the audacity of it, right after the massacre in Gaza, they came to dance in the US. And this wasn't a coincidence, it was very deliberate. The Israeli Foreign Ministry pays a lot of money and has a lot of influence on poets, musicians, dancers, and so on. They send them out in droves after Israel commits any crime to whitewash Israel's crimes. Divesting, as I said, from companies that are profiting from Israel's oppression of the Palestinians or that are Israeli companies. In both cases, it's extremely important and very effective to divest. And Israel realizes the potential of that. If Harvard even seriously debates, not even divests, divesting from Israel, that will be the beginning of the end. So how do I manage to get by with the messages I carry when I go on my tours? I don't get harassed any more than the average. I get harassed as everyone else, but I have not been imprisoned yet. I don't know this time, but I don't want to speak too soon. I have not been imprisoned yet. I think one key to this is that the BDS movement is a non-violent movement, and they're having a lot of trouble criminalizing us. What are they going to say? You know, this is not someone that's calling for armed resistance and burning and killing. We're calling for non-violent boycotts and divestment. How criminal can that be? So it's a very far-fetched argument to say that he is supporting terrorism, or really far-fetched. Second, because I'm speaking in many, many places, we now have a network of activists. I think they understand that arresting someone like me will not be taken lightly by the movement outside. There was a big campaign to expel me from Tel Aviv University because I'm supporting the boycott, because I'm active on the boycott. They collected some 80,000 signatures on the petition to expel me. This is not on the university alone, this is Israel-wide. And it was on TV and national radio, and my name was like everywhere. How we have to expel him, this person who has no gratitude, we're teaching him and he wants to stab us in the back and calling the world to boycott us and so on and so forth. The president of Tel Aviv University set a new precedent because he never comes out publicly speaking about a student. He issued a communique and went out publicly to the media. He said, I'm paraphrasing, I cannot expel him because there are no bylaws that allow me to. I mean, I wish I could, in a way. He was, between the lines, he was saying, he's doing some very nasty things, and I wish I could, but I can't. The only reason why he did not expel me, and I'm saying it publicly, and you know, I've written that, is because he is so scared of the reaction abroad. But, having said that, the current Israeli government is the most stupid of all times. Again, it's the left are very smart, the right are very dumb, so we prefer the right. The right wing in Israel is really dumb. I mean, openly racist, they're openly criminal, they don't give a damn about anything, international law is nothing, they don't care about the US. I mean, Netanyahu speaks to Barack Obama as if he were some, you know, the head of Senegal or something, not the United States of America. Really, extremely condescending, very humiliating. So they're very good for us. But because they're stupid, they might commit things that are very irrational even to their interests, not very beneficial to their interests. Any successes in film festivals around the world? Yes, one recent, especially after Gaza, but even before Gaza, we've had festivals return Israeli official money because we told them accepting Israeli official money to bring an Israeli film or an Israeli artist is complicity. In the Toronto International Film Festival, which was the most recent and the most controversial of all, they had a special tribute to Tel Aviv. at the Toronto International Film Festival. The Academic and Cultural Boycott Campaign, PACB, decided not to call for a boycott of the international festival itself, of Toronto TIFF International Film Festival, but a boycott of the tribute to Tel Aviv. So it's a very nuanced, targeted boycott. Our supporters in Canada started a campaign to have a letter of protest, not to boycott, but to protest the tribute to Tel Aviv. And then some big names got involved into drafting that. John Grayson, Naomi Klein, John Berger, one of the most famous writers in Britain, and others drafted the statement of protest. And Jane Fonda signed it, Danny Glover signed it, and many, many others. Big names. That was the first time we reached Hollywood, finally. Of course, Jane Fonda paid dearly afterwards, and she almost withdrew her signature. She did not. But she said, I didn't read the full text before signing, because the full text said that Tel Aviv is built on an ethnically cleansed Palestinian town, which is a fact, and that Israel was practicing a regime of apartheid, I'm quoting, against the Palestinians, which is a fact, but not a Jane Fonda type of text. I mean, we were shocked that Jane Fonda would sign this. Really, seriously. Even Danny Glover, who's much more progressive than her, on Palestine. But she did sign, and she did not withdraw her signature, but she lost all the funding for her charity, completely, I mean, within 24 hours. She was vilified, she was intimidated, and she was threatened, and she was turned into this devil, anti-Semitic devil, and she's a very pro-Israel person, very Zionist, Jane Fonda. So they vilified her, ADL attacked her, and so on, and they made her the next Khomeini, I mean, really, in the media, Jane Fonda. So she had to apologize profusely for signing, but she never withdrew. But in any way, we got the media to cover the protest much more than the film festival. Okay, it was a comment about hope that at a medical conference at Najah University in Nablus, there were many international physicians that came to support the cause of building a hospital in the occupied territories, and that gave a lot of hope. It shows how internationals can really support. Absolutely, but it's very important to put in parallel that it's not enough to help us build institutions, because Israel destroys them much faster than we build them. It's very important to tell Israel, you are accountable to international law. You shall not have impunity in destroying Palestinian lives anymore.